Well, John Edwards, it seems to me there's a kind of a bit of a contradiction in your proposition. The book's called Beyond the Boom, but you also say in the book that there wasn't any boom. So which is it? Was there a boom or no boom?
Well, I don't think that's quite fair, truthfully, Alan, that there was a boom. In fact, I think the boom continues. But what I do think is that the boom has been very much less influential on the Australian economy than we usually suppose, and my numbers suggest that if you put everything together, all of the mining production, all of the mining investment, everything that went into mining and metals processing, then if you compare 2012 to 2002, that sector was about 3% of GDP bigger than it had been before the boom began. So it's important, but it's not quite as important as is widely supposed.
I suppose the thing is that what you're saying, I suppose your central proposition in a way is that there was a mining boom, but as you say, it wasn't as influential on the economy. So looking at the economy as a whole, income, GDP, and a whole wide range of measures, the previous 10 years to 2002 were higher growth, better than the following 10 years.
Yes, it's quite extraordinary, isn't it, and unexpected that actually in the 10 years before the boom began we grew better than in the 10 years after it began. And it makes the point, I guess, that we've had nearly 23 years of pretty good expansion in the Australian economy, and the mining boom's been an important episode in that, but it's certainly not the only story.
And the other point you make, of course, is that we're beating ourselves up about it all the time, which is interesting.
I do think we're very much more pessimistic than we need to be. One reason is that we magnify the impact of the boom, and consequently, if we think it's being withdrawn, we imagine a great calamity follows. But if the mining boom wasn't quite as big as we think, if, for example, another calculation that the total income gain in, say, 2012 compared to 2002 was about 3% of GDP also, useful but not transformative, then our essential issue as the boom begins to fade, and it's by no means over, is replacing over time, we've got 5, maybe 10 years, 3% of GDP. Well, we can do that. We've certainly done that in the past.
John, during that boom period that you talk about, so 2002-3 onwards, we had record terms of trade, record levels of investment, strong GDP growth, and very low unemployment levels. Are you arguing that had the boom never occurred, we would still have sailed through the global financial crisis and the post-crisis period unaffected?
Oh, I think we probably would. And the reason is that our banks were not strong because of the mining boom. They were strong because, they were more prudent, because we had a financial system that at that point took less risks than the US or UK financial systems. And of course, because, we had a financial collapse at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, from which we learnt quite a lot. So no, I don't think we would have been affected by the global financial crisis in the way other countries were, even if we didn't have a mining boom.
In his book, Dog Days, Ross Garnaut says, as you do, that the impact of the resources boom is about 3% of GDP over the period. But he also said that it peaked at 10% of GDP. That's slightly more significant, isn't it?
Mining is about, on the latest numbers, actually, mining started to go up as a share of GDP. It's now, if you just look at it on quarterly numbers, it's gone to about 11% of GDP, from 9% in 2002-3. I'm talking volumes. So this makes 2 points, I think. One is that actually the mining boom is by no means over. We're seeing big volume increases in iron ore and coal in particular, and we will of course see LNG in big quantities a little further down the track. But I'll also make the point that in 2012, which is what a lot of people think to be the peak of the mining boom, actually mining was the same share of GDP in volume terms as it had been before the boom began, and as a matter of fact, as it had been 20 years before.
Isn't one of the complicating issues here, though, John, that when we talk about the mining boom, we talk about the investment phase of that boom, and as you say, we're now moving into that production phase where we will see volumes go up dramatically over the next few years, particularly as the LNG projects kick in. Will the volume effects be sufficient to offset the very significant price decline we've seen in all the hard commodities?
Well, it's a big help. So far, we're in front. So far, we're not quite in, as I recall the numbers, we're not quite at the level of mining export revenues that we were in 2011, which was the peak, but we're not very far off it, and we will probably soon exceed it. In other words, despite the fall in prices, the increase in volumes has been sufficient to almost offset it, and in a year or two likely completely offset it.
John, every second day I get something from an economist from a bank or investment bank where you used to work yourself, talking about the transition of the Australian economy, and on the whole, the commentary is along the lines that the transition so far is on track. Are you arguing that there isn't really a transition taking place, or that it's on track?
Oh, I think we are. The main transition we need to make, of course, is from the investment boom, as Stephen suggested earlier, to seeing that investment boom peak as it has and begin to come down probably quite rapidly 2 or 3 years hence. It started off as 2% of GDP, got to 7, I think, and it'll go back to, say, 2 or 3. So we're not actually at this point making the transition that we'll need to make, but I think we've begun. That is, we can already see evidence that housing construction is beginning to pick up in response to lower interest rates and unmet demand over the years. And of course there's evidence, as we mentioned before, that mining exports are picking up in a big way, and that will be helpful also. I think we'd all agree we need to see, to effect the transition satisfactorily, we need to see a pickup in non-mining investment. We're beginning to see a bit of that in infrastructure, but we need it more widely, and it's not there yet.
And if one was looking for a reason to be anxious, isn't the issue in terms of this transition from mining investment that the employment in mining investment, resources investment, is about 5 to 8 times the employment in resources operation?
I haven't heard a number 5 to 8 times. Resources operations are not, it's not trivial. It's about 2% of GDP.
No, it's really just the outsized employment in those versus the operational thing. I mean, leaving aside what the exact number is.
Fortunately, if we can make a sharper shift towards infrastructure, then the kind of skills that are now being deployed in mining investment, that is heavy engineering, construction skills, will work well in that new space, as they will be if we see some kind of upturn, which eventually we're going to see in office construction. It's true, as I guess you're implying, that there's not an easy transition between the skills that you use in mining investment and the skills you use in residential construction.
John, conventional wisdom has it that the mining investment boom has contributed to us becoming a high-cost country. And all the comparisons we see with other developed economies, their wages, their costs of developing new mines, buildings, LNG projects, or whatever, producing cars or manufactured food, would suggest that we are high cost. And yet you don't agree with that, do you?
Well, I do think, Stephen, that the far and away the largest element of what we're supposed to be the higher cost is in our exchange rate. And I very much hope we will see a lower exchange rate in coming years because we'll need that to be competitive in a broader range of industries. But I don't think it's true that we have higher minimum wages than other countries however measured, than some other countries, however measured. But as to labour costs overall, I don't think that that case has been demonstrated, other than we know we've got a high exchange rate, and if you compare things in terms of exchange rates, we come out looking quite expensive.
On wage rates, I think that the comparison is that our minimum wage is twice that of the States and about 1.5 times that of Europe. If those relativities are maintained, does that mean we have to vacate certain types of activity?
It does. It does. I think we've made a deliberate decision in this country to minimise certain kinds of activity. For example, we don't have many, private people don't have drivers by and large. They don't have cooks by and large. If they have house cleaners, they're occasional. They don't have full-time gardeners. We don't have that huge class of people doing menial tasks for very low wages, and that was the decision we made many, many years ago, and it characterises us, I guess, as a society.
John, one of the more pointed things you talk about and say is that the federal budget deficit is not due to increased spending but to lower revenue, and that more than half of the problem is caused by the personal income tax cuts delivered by the John Howard Peter Costello government. And I'm just wondering how kind of reckless that was in the circumstances. I mean, and just as the Labor Party tends to bask in the in the glories of its reform era, whether the coalition should apologise for what it did in those years.
Well, Alan, I think the truth is it would have been very, very difficult for Peter Costello to have handled it in a different way. He was running very large surpluses anyway, and to demand that he should have run even bigger surpluses and have allowed tax to rise even more substantially than it did as a share of GDP, I think, is beyond political possibilities. What I do think was a mistake at the time was that the income tax cuts were given in a way that allowed such a big space between the rates and such low rates that when the whole thing turned down, as it did in 2008-9, it turned down very abruptly, income tax didn't come back, or at least it hasn't come back till very recently. Normally, as you know, in the Australian economy, income tax bounces back as nominal GDP recovers, and on this occasion it didn't happen. The interesting thing is that despite all the very sharp debate about Joe Hockey's budget, in fact, the truth is Joe Hockey's budget over the forward estimates is brought back nearly into surplus almost entirely by revenue increases. 80% of the change in the fiscal balance between this financial year just ending and 2017-18, if we exclude for a moment the impact of the $9 billion support for the RBA, if we exclude that, then of the change in the fiscal balance over that period that Hockey has projected, 80% of that is increased revenue, and of that increased revenue, 2/3 is increased income tax, and that's all in the budget. It's all there.
In fact, most of the complaints, I think, are about the period beyond the forward estimates and the sort of big cuts that kick in after that time. And do you think it's because you make a reference in the book to fiscal drag or bracket creep, and that used to be in the Treasury's forecast for revenue over the next 10 years. And would you say that what's occurred beyond the forward estimates, so the sort of second 6 years of the 10-year forecast, that what Hockey has done is in a sense replaced bracket creep with spending cuts over that period.
Well, he has. It's only now that we've sort of got numbers that move out quite as far as this. It's always been the case, of course, or at least certainly the case for many, many years, that if you project spending forward fast enough, it's unsustainable. And that's why every year, the Expenditure Review Committee meets with the Treasurer and the Prime Minister and goes through the numbers and cuts down spending and readjusts it. Well, the way the government, as you say, it's exactly right. What the government's done in these forecasts is to cap tax revenue at, I think, 23.9% of GDP, and you add 1.5% of non-tax revenue. So let's say you've got to 25.5, and you want a 1% surplus. That's taken you to spending as a share of GDP at 24.5. Now, I probably got the arithmetic wrong, but you know what the kind of general direction, and that's what the government's done. So it said, well, look, we're going to cap spending, and they haven't capped it at an excessively low level. I mean, where they've capped it is where it's been pretty much for the last 40 years. But it does remind us that if you have a spending cap, health is going to be pushing against it, as it has for decades, and that's where the fight's going to be when we come around to the next election. Is how much health can we afford, how much education can we afford, and what is the role of the federal government? And it would surprise me, I have to say, Alan, it would surprise me if in 2 years' time Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey are still saying that the federal government is going to get out of these areas.
John, you were right about the long run average, by the way, for spending. It's 24.6 over the last 20 years, 24.6%. In that most recent budget, Commonwealth spending as a proportion of GDP or percentage of GDP is 25.9%. So it's 130 basis points over the long run average. Does that would that worry you? Do you think you have to get it back to the sort of the mid 24s?
Oh, I'm quite happy with if we can get it down to 24.6, that's good. I think that 25.9 number, Stephen, might include the 9 billion to the RBA, which is more than 0.5% of GDP. So we're really closer to 25. If you took it. It's very tedious, these numbers, I know, but if you took it for the year for which we have actual numbers, is the prior year, 2012-13, and there I think you'll see that spending as a share of GDP is 24 point something. So there was a big bounce in spending in the in 2013-14, for most of which Joe Hockey was Treasurer, and it may, I think, have somewhat artificially inflated the number. But I do think, actually, we should endeavour to constrain spending to somewhere between 24 and 25, as we have. And that means, in the long run, we're going to have to be much more efficient in our health spending and remain careful in all other areas.
Do you think, in fact, that it's possible to hold spending under 25%, given the increase in life expectancy and health costs that flow from that?
And NDIS and Gonski.
And NDIS and Gonski. I mean, really, is it feasible to do it?
Well, I'm not quite sure, I'm not quite sure. It certainly would be, I think a good aim for a Treasurer to see if they can get there. As you know, the health is not really driven by ageing, it's driven by technology and by the availability of better medical procedures and people's interest in prolonging, a healthy life. It's very, and given that so much of health spending is underpinned by government support, it may be that we've just got to recognise that there's a public preference for health spending as opposed to other forms of spending, and maybe we need to recognise that and continue to support it. I'm also very strongly in favour of the Gonski funding because the numbers tell us that where we're failing in Australian education, and we're not failing in many areas, but we are failing in offering the most opportunity, getting the best out of the bottom quarter of children, most of whom come from low-income backgrounds. That's where we need to do the work to get the average up, and that's what the Gonski money does.
So, John, why do you think there is all this despondency, given the obvious fact that Australia is doing fine? Is it simply, as you propose, that certain people are kind of inclined to manufacture a crisis in order to push reform?
Well, it's a very interesting question. I mean, we would have said before the election, in fact, I think you did say, you and Stephen did say that, well, everybody's feeling despondent because they're despondent about the government, and then we changed the government and people, they're despondent again. So it's probably not the government. It might be, as you suggest, that we don't make enough of our achievements, that we're a little concerned that if we say we're doing well, it robs us of some impetus, to do even better. But I do think we have to, we've lost, the policy discussion is losing credit in the community because it's not recognising the reality of people's lives. That we are in the 23rd year of uninterrupted expansion. And so I do think we've got to change the discourse somehow or other to recognise our success and to find a way of premising reform and improvement not on threats of imminent catastrophe, which are not credible, but a more sensible conversation about perpetuating our success.
Perhaps it's just that nobody likes a boaster.
I don't know.
John, can you just explain to us what the motivation in writing this book was? I mean, because you are looking backwards rather than forwards.
Well, I don't know whether I didn't intend to look backwards, but I do think we have to establish the base from what we're discussing. And in particular, I wanted to investigate, there are 4 propositions: that the mining boom is over, that the mining boom was huge and transformed us, that without the mining boom we're in calamitous circumstances, and that we squandered the mining boom. Now, all of those propositions then invite a view about where we should go next and what we must do, beginning with the idea that we've got to make huge changes in this country to all our institutions, but including our government, and the way our government works. If, on the other hand, you take the view that actually we've been fairly successful, then you're concerned to say, well, look, let's make sure, whatever else we do, that we preserve the things that have been useful to us, that have been associated with that success, and let's look to improvements that are, consistent with the things that have made us successful.
Thanks very much for joining us, John.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, John.